All right, it's not letting me share for some reason.
Anybody else to host?
I did not set it up, but screen recording. I'm in system preferences and I don't have anything about allowing Zoom to share. I'm in privacy, so and I've got it up, but unfortunately you can't see it. So if you have a Torah available to you, otherwise you'll have to sort of take my word, but I'm going to read it anyway. The section that we're going to be looking at, which is exactly the same as the Torah portion that's read from the two Torahs on Yom Kippur. And the first Torah we read is from chapter 16, verses 1 through 34. But I'm going to spend the bulk of the time on verse 5 and then the last 5 verses, because after verse 5, for the next 24 verses, we have the rules of the scapegoat, which is nice, but has nothing to do with us. And it starts with, from the congregation of the children of Israel, he talking about the...
Is this Deuteronomy? Is this?
This is Leviticus,
Okay.
chapter 15, and we're in verse 5.
Okay.
Deuteronomy is a good question because we're going to get to that at the end. But right now we're in Leviticus chapter 16, verse 5.
Thank you.
From the congregation of the children of Israel, he will take two kids of the goats. That's 2 kids, one for a chatat, and the 2 kids for a chatat, and one ram for an olah. And the reason I don't translate those, and chatat is usually translated as a sin offering, and olah is translated as a burnt offering. But chatat as a sin offering makes sense because the root word is chet, which means sin. But the burnt offering, the olah, is simply the word that means going up. And so usually translated as a burnt offering because all of it, when you burn it, all of the smoke goes up. But it's uncertain exactly what form of sacrifice was intended, how they were intended to do it. The Mishnah is going to spend a lot of time on how these offerings were done and how many priests were needed to do them. You know, it's the old, how many priests does it take to sacrifice a ram? And they said, well, some said you need 6 and 8 and 10 and 12 because they have to tear it apart, and some hold the head and some hold the foot and some hold this part. And as the British would say, the whole thing of these sacrifices is a bloody mess. But then it's all about those 2 goats and the casting of the lots, and which goat goes to God and which goat goes to Azazel, getting sent off to carry all of our sins away with it. The Mishnah is going to expand on that and then is going to tell us what happens if the goat dies before it was chosen, what happens if it dies after it was chosen. There's lots of stuff in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is going to spend most of Tractate Yoma on the rules of the sacrifices of Yom Kippur by the priests, which is a historical session in and of itself to study, because the Mishnah is written down approximately 130 years after the temple has been destroyed. That is the Second Temple by Rome. And does not exist at the time that they're discussing all of the rules of temple. But meanwhile, I'm moving on to Leviticus chapter 16, verse 29, which gives the rules for everybody else on Yom Kippur. And it begins with, it will be to you a chukat olam. Chok is one of the words in the Torah that is used as a way of telling us that these are rules and regulations that the Torah is giving us. We have mishpat, we have judgments, we have mitzvah, we have commandments, we have chok, which is often translated as a statute. They're legal terms back in the Torah times, and the rabbis then discuss the differences among them. And one of the categories, the chok, is often referred to things that we wouldn't have figured out for ourselves. These are rules and regulations that God gives us that don't on the surface seem to make any sense. But we do them because they do make sense. We just have to figure it out, or we have to trust that God knows what we're doing. But it's a chok olam. So all of the stuff about the scapegoat, which was done here. Now remember Leviticus, and in my notes, I have a reminder because one of my themes that I've been following from Rosh Hashanah through Yom Kippur, and we've been doing in our Sunday morning Torah class, Hebrew Torah, is the different strains of Torah. Leviticus is credited almost entirely to the P author, the priest author, and so therefore deals with the rules and regulations around the priests, the Levites and the Kohanim. Leviticus is generally referring to all of the rules of the priests in the wandering in the wilderness. So this chok olam, in the context of the book of Leviticus, is the rules for the priests, not for the people. And it's the rules for what is being done here during the wandering in the wilderness. And the idea, of course, when it's later collated into the Torah text of the priestly author, once Israel has been settled in temple times, is we still do what they did back then because they did it back then and we still do it. So while this is the rule in the wandering in the wilderness, this is theoretically the rule that the priests do in Jerusalem at the temple. And one can imagine that if they in fact still did it, that it would have been a very different kind of setup, people coming to the city temple, the temple in the middle of whatever version Jerusalem had of being a town or city, and then they have to send it off to Azazel, which is out in the outskirts of town into the hills, into the wilderness. But Leviticus here is talking about what's happening now, but says chok olam, it will always be, it will be an eternal rule, an eternal statute, a statute for all times. Olam, of course, being the Hebrew word both for time and space and universe and world, and so translated in our later blessings as God of the world or God of the universe. I like to translate olam as space-time continuum because it has that sense of the ongoing core essence of where we are, were, and will be. But meanwhile, it's a chok olam, and now we get the only statement for what is to be done outside of this scapegoat business, and it says, Ta'anu et nafshotechem, you will ta'anu your souls. Usually translated as afflict, but if you look up the Hebrew word root, it has actually two meanings and then expanded meanings within those two meanings. One meaning of the root ana, ayin, nun, he is to answer. The other root of ana, ayin, nun, he, afflict is one of the choices, but also humble and bring down and almost debase in some ways. It's got an expanded meaning of making somebody considerably less haughty by taking them in the opposite direction. So the translation, the usual translation of afflict your souls, I translate as humble your souls. The book of Leviticus tells us, and it's in the plural form, so whereas all of the scapegoat was what the priest does, and is talking about the role of the congregation with the priest, watching the priest do it, here suddenly it says, you all will humble your souls, and it does not tell us further who the you all is, whether it's all of the Levites, whether it's the Kohanes gathered around, whether it's all of the people. And beyond that, it does not tell us what we're supposed to do to humble our souls. That is the sum total of the rules and regulations for self of Yom Kippur. And then it goes on and says, V'chol malacha lo ta'asu, and all work you will not do. But that's not unusual because that's also true on Shabbat. That's also true on the beginning, the holy days of Pesach, of Sukkot, of Shavuot. So there are a lot of times that we're told, take off from work, don't do any work. And it says, Kol malacha, all work you will not do. And the rabbis then have to tell us what are the various forms of malacha. The Torah gives us nothing. And who is responsible to do this? Ha-ezrach v'hager hagar b'tochachem. Who is responsible to do this? The Ezrach, the homeborn, the native, and the ger hagar, the sojourner who is sojourning in your midst. Later, ger is going to become a convert, but ger here is simply perhaps somebody with a green card or somebody waiting for a green card. It's a foreigner who has become a part of the community in some way. So it's hager hagar, the sojourner who sojourns. And this is to be done by the homeborn and by the sojourner without any reference to whether either of those or both of those or neither of those are B'nai Yisrael. Because it does not say in Leviticus, B'nai Yisrael, it says the homeborn and the sojourner may therefore be referring to all of the non-B'nai Yisrael, those who have born into the B'nai Yisrael families or community, and those who are just passing through but settling in for a while. It then goes on, verse 30, for in this day will be atonement on you. It says, on this day, ki vayom hazeh, on this day, yechaper aleichem, atonement on you, will be atonement on you. And the word kippur is, of course, the root that gives us Yom HaKippurim, the day of the kippars, the day of the atonements. And then l'taher etchem, usually translated as to purify or to cleanse. The word taher is, as Reb Moshe likes to say, and I like, is really a matter of to be ready, to be prepared, to be in a state that would allow one to participate. So you are making these, on that day you will make atonement. Again, it doesn't tell us how to make atonement, what it means to make atonement, only that we will it will be atonement for us if we are not working and if we are humbling our souls so that we will be ready. We will be in a state of preparedness from all of our sins. And that's before Yud He Vav He, you will be ready. Titharu, you will be made ready. Verse 31 tells us Shabbat Shabbaton, which is usually translated as a Sabbath of Sabbaths, or sometimes, as I've seen in translations, a Sabbath of complete rest. I translated it, if you could see it, as a Shabbat of Shabbating. So Shabbat Shabbaton, a Shabbat of whatever we do, what Shabbat is, whatever it means, whatever rest it is. And it will be for you then a Shabbat of Shabbats, a Shabbat of Shabbating. And again, it tells us, V'initem et nafshotechem, you will humble your souls. And again, it reminds us that this too is a chukat olam. This is a chok for all times. Then it's back to the Kohen, and verse 32, and the Kohen does this kippuring, the Kohen does this atoning, and it's the Kohen asher yimshach oto. It says the Kohen that you will anoint. And this becomes for the P author, who was writing many hundreds of years after the Exodus experience, after the wilderness experience would have taken place, is now saying, just as they did it then for the Kohen, so we continue to do it. So this justifies the ongoing Yom Kippur rules that are not explained in the book of Leviticus by the priestly author for the people, indicating probably that everybody knew what they were supposed to do, or indicating, as the tradition will tell us, that they had a copy of the oral tradition as well that was not yet written down and would not yet be written down for hundreds of years until the Mishnah is written down, that they knew, that is the priests, the Kohens, the ones running the show, knew all the rest of the rules and told us as we went along what they were, but when they wrote it down in the book of Leviticus, the P document of the Torah, they didn't tell us what it was. They just said that the Kohen who will be anointed, so that is the leader of the priestly groups who in any generation, because it's a chok olam, will always be there. It says, Yimale Yado. So Yimshach Oto Va'asher Yimale et Yado. So the priest that you have anointed and you have filled his hand. L'chahen tachat aviv. So he is the one who is going to Kohen, to do the service in place of or under literally his father. So in verse 32, we're told that the Kohen of every generation, the one that is anointed in that generation, that has had his hand filled in that generation, without, again, in the book of Leviticus telling us what his hand was filled with. So he was anointed and his hand was filled, which was apparently a ritual of validating the priest, the Kohen of his generation. And he is the Kohen now in place of his father, who was the Kohen, because Kohen comes from the father. The role of the Kohen is the role of the father. And that becomes implicit here and will become explicit other places. But here is simply a reminder that, and by the way, it is not the Kohen Gadol, that is the big kahuna, but it's simply the Kohen. And so again, in the P document, in the priestly document, apparently there's only one Kohen who is doing all of this. And of course, there were many Kohens. But this is the Kohen who does it in place of his father, who was the Kohen, and the Hebrew word for what the Kohen does, the infinitive is lichahen, which is to Kohen. And Kohen is actually better translated not as priest, but as server. Because lichahen is then to serve in the role of whatever it is that a Kohen does. So he's doing this Kohening, his serving, in place of his father, who was the Kohen before him. And he has to lavash at bigdei habad and bigdei hakodesh. He has to wash his garments that are made of linen, and he has to wash his garments of holiness. So the idea that the priest is decked out in some kind of special outfit, which is described again in other places. He has to make sure that he's washed his clothes before doing all of this kippuring, this atoning that's going on. And then verse 33, it says, he will do the kippuring, he will do the atoning of the mikdash hakodesh. The mikdash is the Hebrew word for the holy place, and hakodesh is the holy. So it's really the holy place of the holy. The mikdash later is going to be the temple in Jerusalem, but in the wanderings in the wilderness, there wasn't a temple in Jerusalem, there was the tabernacle. And up and from the time of the entrance under Joshua until the time of the building of the temple under Solomon, there was no one mikdash. And for the priestly document, one can wonder whether this indicated that any of the mikdash hakodeshes throughout what was Israel in the tribal period and even up until the Saul and David kingdom period were wherever there happened to be a mikdash kodesh, a holy place of holiness. And this was not the Kohen in Jerusalem, but rather this was the local Kohen from among the Levites. So that's a whole nother discussion. But Leviticus tells us to do all these things as if we were in the wilderness, as if this is being set up in the wilderness for all times, without an awareness of a temple in Jerusalem. So there's no statement of when there is one holy place, but rather whatever, and it's a generic, in the holy place of the holy place of the holinesses. And then, so the priest has to atone the place. It's atoning the Mikdash HaKodesh and atoning the Ohel Moed. The Ohel Moed is usually translated as the tent of meeting. And so the tabernacle, as it's constructed in the book of Exodus, was this big tented area with a holy of holies, a sacrificial holy place in the middle of the tent of the giant tent. And so if the priest has to somehow atone the whole place separately, the larger space and the smaller space. The interesting thing about calling it the temple of meeting, the tent of meeting, of course, is moed, is usually refers to a festival, a time of gathering. We have on the Sukkot and Pesach, the intervening days are called Chol HaMoed, the weekdays of the sacred time or the special time. So Moed really is and we have Moadim, which are the seasonal times. We have a number of different statements of time frame in the Torah. Moed refers to specific seasonal times or celebrations. So again, I would call Ohel Moed the tent of the seasonal gathering, as opposed to the tent of meeting. It's the tent specifically set up for the gatherings for the appropriate seasons or timely events. Again, this goes back and forth between what's being done in the wilderness and what's being set up as a system or principle for a future time. So again, and not only does the Mikdash HaKodesh and the Ohel Moed have to be atoned, but the Mizbeach has to be atoned, the altar itself. So one can picture the Kohen walks around and doesn't tell us how the Kohen does the kippering, does the atoning. Rather, after afflicting his soul, or all of us afflicting our souls or humbling our souls, the next thing we know, the priest has to then wash his clothes, both the linen garments and the holy garments, the festival garments. And then the priest, the picture is sort of backwards, because we would expect it to be the Ohel Moed, do the big space, and then move in and do the Mikdash Kodesh, the smaller holy space, and then go in and do the altar. But the text says first he does the holy place, then he goes backwards and does the big place, and then he goes forward into the holy place and does the altar. So the order is somewhat of an issue. But again, this is what Leviticus tells us to do, which really doesn't tell us what to do. It tells us what was done without really telling us the details of what was done, and then says this is a chok olam, as if we will be in the wilderness for all time, or when we're not in the wilderness, we still have to do this as if we were in the wilderness, which becomes its own problem. And by doing this, the Kohen then does atonement for all of the Kohanim, and all of a sudden the Kohen is doing it for all the Kohanim. So it doesn't say which Kohen, other than among the Kohanim, apparently one of them will be chosen to be anointed, have his hands filled, and take the place of his father, who had been the Kohen who did this, who had been in the place of his father, who had done this, who was done in the place of, ultimately, we get back to Aaron, because we know the initial only Kohen was Aaron. When Moses is told to take Aaron, his cousin, brother, whatever he was, who was a Levite like Moses, and turn him from a Levite into a Kohen. So takes him from within the tribe and turns him into a special server. And then it's going to be, after that, it's going to be whatever server is chosen in place of Aaron from among his sons. And then that son will choose one of his sons, and that son will, but meanwhile, all of the other sons of Aaron are having sons, except of course the two who are killed by the fire and from the altar, but that's another story. So there's multiple Kohanim in the time of the priestly document, the Levitical document being written down, but in the time of the wandering in the wilderness, there are not a lot of Kohanim running around. But Leviticus acts as if this was done in the time when there were a lot of Kohanim, and then tells us that there are not a lot of Kohanim. But apparently one Kohen, without being mentioned which one. And again, the interesting thing is, while this is being done in the book of Leviticus, which takes its place in the wandering in the wilderness, Aaron is never mentioned. Moses is never mentioned in this text, but they are going back and acting perhaps as if they were, but everybody knew that was who it was. So the Kohen atones for the tent of meeting, atones for the holy place, atones for the altar, and then atones for all of the other Kohanim, and then atones for Al Kol Am HaKahal Yechaper, and then for all of the people of the congregation are atoned. And in case you weren't sure, verse 34 closes by saying this will be a chok olam. Again, this will be an eternal law for atoning for, and finally we get Bnei Yisrael from all of their sins, achat bashana, and this is to be done one time per year, once a year. And finally, and he did, vayas, he did, ka'asher tziva Adonai et Moshe, and he did just as had been commanded to Moses. So finally, the Levitical chapter 16 that we've been looking at, chapter 16, which is the first Torah read on Yom Kippur morning, has all of those rules about the Kohen and the sacrificial altar and all of the scapegoat, which is the bulk of the text. And now we're going to go to the second Torah, which is now we're in Numbers chapter 29, verses 7 to 11. Numbers chapter 29 is a long series of all of the rules around all of the holy times of the year. And so and Numbers chapter 29 is always the second Torah read at all of the holidays, the holy days, the festivals, because somewhere in chapter 29 is every holiday, every festival. Going back into putting this into our context, chapter 29 is purported to have been written by the editor-redactor of the Torah. So this is the latest version of what was happening at the time of the putting of all of the different pieces of the Torah together, possibly by Ezra, whoever the editor-redactor or editor-redactor lead person or community was. This is what is added to the Torah to weave the original J and E and P and D, all of the different documents together to make it into one unified whole. So by the time the editor-redactor is putting this down, the practice on Yom Kippur, which is still temple related, is different from Leviticus. So remember in Leviticus, it was primarily, this is what they did in the wilderness, the scapegoats, and then the atoning and the afflicting or the humbling of the souls without any statement about what form, what version of atoning the priest was doing. The sense that there was one Kohen on behalf of all of the Kohens who were doing this, and there are only 2 goats and 1 ram. 2 goats, one for the sacrifice of Chatat and one for the sending off to Azazel, and then 1 ram for the whatever the Olah form of sacrifice was to be done. By the time we get to Numbers chapter 29, verses 7 to 11, there's only 4 verses for all of the Yom Kippur laws, according to the editor-redactor, that needed to be added into the later combined Torah text to make sense for the people of that time in the temple, the way that it was being practiced. So on the 10th day of the 7th month, it will be a Mikra Kodesh, usually translated as holy convocation. Mikra comes from the word to call. So this is a calling together, a convocation of holiness. It will be to you, and again, the same language, initem et nafshotechem, you will humble your souls, without any statement about how the humbling of the souls is to be done. And kol malacha lo ta'asu, and all work you will not do. That is the sum total of the rules and regulations in the book of Numbers, in the final editing, redacting version of the Torah, of what the people of Israel have to do on the 10th day of the 7th month. They have to gather together in a holy convocation. They have to humble their souls, and they have to do no work. The rest of that is then the priestly rules. For verse 8 through verse 11 are the priestly rules of the sacrifices. And as I read through, I'll give you a little bit of a warning. There's no scapegoat. And it says, you will bring an olah, and the olah will be a sweet, pleasing odor. And the olah will be a young bull, a ram, and 7 lambs, all of which are unblemished. So all of a sudden, our 2 kids and our 1 ram have become a bull, a ram, a lamb, and 7 lambs, rather. And then all of a sudden now there is a mincha offering, which is choice flour mingled in oil. And the Hebrew solet belulah vashemen. Solet is the finest flour or the choicest flour. Belulah is usually translated as mingled vashemen with oil, in oil. The Hebrew belulah, the mingling of the solet of the fine flour, vashamen in oil, is the same word balal that was used way back in Genesis when God confounded or confused people's languages. So the word to mingle the flour with the oil is the same word as confounding or confusing. So one could almost picture that the oil and the flour have to be so mixed together that you can't tell what's oil and what's flour. They've been confused one for the other. Then you take this fine flour oil business, and it's just a bit of flour paste or some form of oily dough, and 3/10 of it, and one can wonder how they measured it out, but they must have cut it into pieces and said, oh, that looks like about 1/10. But 3/10 of it then went to the bull, and 2/10 of it went to the ram, and 1/10 of it each to the 7 lambs. So if you add 3/10 plus 2/10 plus 5/10 plus 7/10 rather, you get 12/10 of this is being sent to each of the lambs, which means we're using 120% of the mixture that we just made. So something's wrong with the math. Unless it's 3/10 is given to the bull, and then it's all mixed back together, and 2/10 of what's left is given to the ram, and then it's mixed together, and 7/10 of it is given to each of the 1/10 of it is given to each of the 7 lambs. So the book of Numbers, which gives us whole bunches of rules of Yom Kippur, has some problems, aside from the fact that it doesn't work with the Levitical rules, because Levitical rules, again, were about the wilderness. The Numbers rules is about the temple in Jerusalem. And then it says, one of the kids is a chatat. And then it says, beside the chatat of the atonement, and it says this is going to be a olat hatamid, so it's a continual olah, and tamid usually means is translated as eternal, as in the ner tamid, the eternal light, but tamid doesn't mean really eternal. That we got olam for that. Tamid is always, or continually, or continuously. And it's a very ambiguous term, as much so in the Hebrew as the word always in English, because you ask somebody, what does always mean? And they will tell you. And then I've challenged people further and said, what percentage of your time do you spend on something that you always do? And the best example is, do you always brush your teeth? And when they tell me that always means 100% of your time, I say, oh, that's an interesting way to brush your teeth. So the eternal light, even that we hang over the altar and the bima and the ark and everything, that's a whole nother discussion as well. But meanwhile, it says that we've got these lambs and these offerings, and we've got suddenly an olah and a mincha, and then we have a niskeh, which is usually translated as a drink offering. So I'm going to expand my own screen because I don't need to look at the text anymore. And unfortunately, as I said, for some reason, even though it says share screen, there was something that had to be done to let me share the screen. So you can go back to Leviticus and to Numbers and you can read it for yourself. But even from the time of Leviticus to the priestly document, to the full creating of the Torah under the editor redactor with the Numbers document, we can already see that there was evolution of the rules and regulations of the Yom Kippur. However, in the time of the temple, especially, these rules and regulations were primarily related to the Kohen, to the priest, and to the sacrifices. We're not going to spend a lot of time, but just to let you know, in the Mishnah, in Mishnah Yoma, there's a long discussion about the rules and regulations of Yom Kippur. The vast majority of those are around the priests and the offerings, since the vast majority of the Torah text was around the priests and the offerings. The vast majority of the Mishnah will be around the priests and the offerings. The Mishnah, however, does give us a few more personal rules than the Torah did, because the Mishnah better defines what humbling our souls is all about. And it's very simple. You don't do 5 things on Yom Kippur. You don't eat, you don't drink, you don't anoint yourself with oil, you don't have marital relations, and you don't wear shoes. The Mishnah does not say anything about leather. The Mishnah says don't wear shoes. The Talmud's going to expand on that in the Talmud tractate Yoma, and eventually we get to, and the notice about the Mishnah, by the way, the Mishnah is written down, according to most tradition, around the year 200. The temple was destroyed 130 years earlier. So by the time the Mishnah is writing down all these rules and regulations about the role of the Kohen in the temple, there is no temple. And there is a growing concern there won't be again for a long time. The Talmud goes further, and I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes just letting you know what the Shulchan Aruch. So eventually the Talmud expands into its form that we know of it today, and it's closed. And then, of course, once it's closed, it's not done, because life goes on, evolution goes on, society continues to change, and new rules have to develop. We get commentaries to the Talmud. Eventually, we start getting law codes from the Talmud, because the Talmud, the Mishnah, just to give you a little bit of context, the Torah tells us what God wants us to do according to Moses. The Mishnah tells us what God wants us to do according to Moses's oral traditions that Moses handed down to a select group of people in every generation until it's finally written down. And the Mishnah rarely refers back to the Torah. So the Mishnah, when it gives us rules, simply says, here are the rules, in a sense, that expand upon what everybody knew, but now not everybody knows. So now we're going to get it all written down. So the Mishnah doesn't really refer back to the Torah. The Talmud then is an expansion of the Mishnah, and often gives us the justification for Mishnah rules by looking at Mishnah and Torah and putting them together. But the Talmud is also filled with lots of fun stories. So, because of course, by the time the Talmudic authors are writing their things, people are interpreting in different communities in different ways in different places, and there are discussions, never an argument, always a discussion among the various rabbis. And so the Talmud will tell us, Rabbi so-and-so said do it this way, but another rabbi said do it that way, and the bulk of the sages said do it this way. And a lot of times in the Talmud, there's once upon a time, Rabbi so-and-so was walking along the way and was doing something. A student said to him, why are you doing this? And he said, because I'm doing this. Talmud, therefore, has a lot of things that don't help us know what we're supposed to do. So after the Talmud is completed and the commentaries are being written to it, some people came along and said, we're going to go through the Talmud and we're going to pick out just the rules and regulations. Joseph Caro was one, Maimonides was one, and eventually there's a collection of the rules and regulations of Judaism based on the Talmud, which is based on the Torah and the Mishnah, and it's called Shulchan Aruch. The table is set because Jewish practice is not belief, Jewish practice is practice. So the Shulchan Aruch doesn't tell us what we have to believe, it tells us what we have to do. And the table is set, we set the table before God, and we spend our lives eating at God's table. So the table is set. And in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which is the Reader's Digest version of the Shulchan Aruch, boiling it down to just 4 books, in book 3, we have a discussion about all the rules and regulations around all of the holy days throughout the year. And you have to wait till you get to about page 80 of that before you get to the rules of Yom Kippur. Tells us what we do before Yom Kippur, does tell us a little bit of what the priests used to do before Yom Kippur, tells us what people have to do before Yom Kippur, then it tells us what people have to do on the night of Yom Kippur, then it tells us what people have to do on Yom Kippur, and the discussion in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch around who fasts and who doesn't fast, and illness and young children and ages and pregnant and nursing women and what did the illness do. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, by the way, gives us a whole discussion about a ritual of kippering, of atoning, which it calls kaparot. And kaparot replaces the old goats and rams and bulls and everything else and lambs with chickens. And a man takes a male chicken, a rooster, and a woman takes a female chicken, a hen, and they wave it over their head. And that was the tradition of kaparot. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, by the way, says a pregnant woman might take both a chicken and a hen and a rooster just in case the child is male. But then it says, but don't worry if you don't do that because one is all it takes. But it's interesting again because the female takes the female and the male takes the male in the discussion. And then there is a whole section discussion on wearing shoes. None of this, by the way, did we find in the book of Leviticus. None of this did we find in the book of Numbers. And the question about Deuteronomy is there is no Yom Kippur in Deuteronomy. So that becomes a whole nother area that one might discuss. But I'll just leave you with the shoes that you cannot wear on Yom Kippur. You cannot wear shoes, even if they're made of wood without leather covering. And that's the only place where it really talks about the wearing of leather on Yom Kippur. It's not the wearing of leather, but the wearing apparently of shoes with leather covering, even if they're shoes that sometimes have leather covering, sometimes don't. And so they're the wooden shoes or the good old Dutch shoes, you can't wear. But if your shoes are made of rubber, straw, or other kinds of materials like that, then you can wear them. But you really shouldn't wear any shoes, even if it's muddy out and wet. But if you do happen to wear shoes because it's muddy out, you have to take your shoes off before you get into your worship place. And I guess walk around in the worship place in socks. So the wearing of sandals, and if you do, if there's a worry about your health with the shoes or the walking, you can wear shoes, but you have to make sure they have no heels on them. So you can wear flip-flops or sandals. So this is a whole discussion in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch about what it does. And also in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is a statement that you have to give some yourself or be given stripes. And here we have a leather strap. It's not supposed to hit you too hard, but has to hit you in the backside, even if it's not 4 inches wide, made of leather. So we have a whole long discussion about afflicting or humbling our souls on Yom Kippur, and a lot of discussion around that. If you can get a copy of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and I think it's available online, it's fun to read what the basic rules that led to the modern approach. The other place I recommend, if you want to know the rules and regulations of the tradition, you can go to Chabad.org. Chabad.org has great answers to almost any question that you might want to know, and you'll be surprised at times as to what Chabad.org has to say when you thought you knew what the Orthodox were going to tell you. So with that, we have a minute or so left. Any comments, questions before you head off to doing, now that you know what you should be doing on Yom Kippur and have no idea what that is? And you can unmute as you like to.
It's a good thing I like going barefoot.
What about wearing white?
So yes, so wearing white, it actually says that when you go to services on Yom Kippur, you actually wear a kittel, a robe, but it's a white robe that is supposed to be like your burial shroud. So you're actually supposed to wear either your actual burial shroud or symbolic of your burial shroud on Yom Kippur.
Approximately what year was Shulchan Aruch?
Shulchan Aruch, I forget, it's written, it's accumulated actually from traditions. I think it's 12th, 13th century, but I'd have to go back and check to be sure.
I was asking because then it makes me think that, you know, I don't need the precise year, but it was sort of late Middle Ages getting into modern times.
Right, yes, it's definitely Middle Ages. It's definitely several hundred years post-Talmudic. That's the same time period that Maimonides is writing. And there was actually a blended document. Originally, there was an Ashkenazic document, and then there was a Sephardic edition or overview, which was actually called the Mapa, which is the tablecloth. So you had the later blending of the Ashkenazic and Sephardic traditions, although they're not necessarily the Sephardic don't follow all of the Shulchan Aruch Ashkenazic views, and the Ashkenazic don't follow all of the Sephardic views. So even into the modern age, you have different traditions in the Ashkenazic and Sephardic world, and you actually have different traditions even among the non-Ashkenazic, non-Sephardic. The Yemenite traditions have their own, and of course the Ethiopian and other traditions brought their own in. But yes, it's quite an evolution from Leviticus even to Numbers, and then from Numbers to the Mishnah, from the Mishnah to the Talmud, and from the Talmud to the Shulchan Aruch, and then from the Shulchan Aruch to modern age, which the liberal view is its evolution. The traditional view is, no, it's always been the same. It just didn't always get written down or get understood the same way.
So where does one find the white kittel or whatever?
You can go to your local Jewish funeral home
Oh boy.
and buy from them your burial shroud, wear it on Yom Kippur, and then you've got it so the congregation doesn't have to provide it for you later. But otherwise, you go to places like the Israel Bookshop and you buy yourself your kittel. You buy, or you go online to jewishgarments.com. I don't know, whatever places where
Amazon.
you buy garments. You can also go online and get yourself your shtreimel and all of the rest of the stuff that you need so you can be Hasidic.
No, thanks.
It was so interesting and superb. Thank you,
All right.
Rabbi
Thank
Sam.
you all for joining.
Thank you so much. I really.
Thank you,
did.
Rabbi
Thank you.
All right, and
Thank you.
easy and good fast for everyone, and take care of yourselves for the
Gam
next
lecha.
6-7 hours.
Yes.
Good night, Torah.
Bye.
Everybody be sealed well.
Yes, absolutely.